the past, I've told you stories about some of the most heated world races that Final Fantasy XIV has ever seen, pitting players against overwhelming odds, their opposition hot at their heels, and the chance of glory firmly within their grasp, if they can just keep their cool through one last mechanic. The release of a new Savage or Ultimate is an event in the community. Streaming categories become a hot spot for the week, as even those that aren't traditionally deeply invested in raiding take a peek at the new challenges and set pieces that Square Enix have thought up, and enjoy watching how the best of the best overcome them. After a few days, it's all over. The victor is cemented, guides are beginning to proliferate, and the excitement has started to dissipate. But it wasn't always that way. In today's story, we'll be visiting a different area of Eorzea's player-written history, one many were not around to witness, where both jobs and community were almost unrecognizable to today's iterations, and where, in the depths of the caverns beneath Castrum Occidens, the first, longest, and most grueling world race Final Fantasy XIV has ever and will ever see took place. This is the story of the Binding Coil of Bahamut, the world first that happened twice.
Our group never really intended to do what Prog. We're going in there as a completely fresh group, and most people haven't even raided before, right? People will look back at Twintania and be like, oh, it took so long. Yeah, that Prog took a long time for a lot of reasons. We could have killed that fight about a month earlier.
Killer, fucking killer, holy shit. Oh my fucking shit! Holy fucking shit! You fucking badasses!
Before this story can really get going, it's important to understand the context within which it happens. This race took place in the immediate aftermath of A Realm Reborn's release, whilst it was still unclear if Yoshida's gambit had paid off, and the two are very interlinked. On November 11th, 2012, Final Fantasy XIV died, and it was fated to be remembered as a failure, a Frankenstein's beast of awkward, scrappily structured menus and user interfaces, time gating, bugs, and a distinct lack of anything interesting to engage with. It was utterly battered in both critic reviews and forum discussions. Its priorities were all wrong, and it hadn't learned a single lesson from its predecessor, nor from its much more successful peers. There's an anecdote that Naoki Yoshida told at a GDC presentation one time that I think always brings the state of that release into perspective immediately. The servers were unstable, sometimes suffering up to 400 crashes in a single day. But instead of prioritizing making them run smoothly, the development team set their sights on much prettier targets: flower pots. 1.0's flower pots took over 1,000 polygons and 140 lines of shader code to render, more than was required to do the same for a player character. Because of their obsession with visual fidelity over, working, in form over function, in ensuring that essential set pieces like flower pots were of sufficient quality, they had to make drastic concessions in regards to things like the number of player characters that could be displayed on screen, which was capped at 20. The MMORPG could barely manage more players on screen than in your average Call of Duty game. Instead of considering it of any importance to release features or content in a working state, they deemed it better to just release it now and fix it in a patch later. It didn't pan out. So after just 2 years of shambling along in dire straits, it was eradicated in a blaze of glory as the heavens fell and the moon Dalamud hurtled to the ground, destroying all those with the audacity to witness the spectacle. The Elder Primal Bahamut was unleashed and it accepted no prisoners, taking down the servers and marking the death of the game itself. And that was the end of that. For a while, at least. They had been rebuilding the game behind the scenes in parallel with patching the original, keeping 1.0 on life support whilst diligently working to construct a superior successor that would do the name Final Fantasy proud. After pushing themselves to their absolute limits under the new leadership of Naoki Yoshida for the past few years, introspecting and improving and learning, 2.0 was ready to go out to the public. It featured a new user interface, entirely rewritten server infrastructure, graphics engine and battle system, brand new story, and 2 new jobs in the form of Scholar and Summoner. They aimed to modernize and reflect the quality and energy that the franchise is known for. In an apology for their past failures, those that had owned 1.0 got 2.0 for free. This was make or break for the company, as Square Enix had suffered a disastrous fiscal year. Another failure like 1.0 would likely shutter them. On August 27th, 2013, A Realm Reborn was released to the public. It was the old game, rebuilt from the ground up with the intention of being good this time, and with the lofty aspirations of being able to compete with the genre's top dog, World of Warcraft. It succeeded, too. It jumped from a 49 on Metacritic to an 86, and had so many players picking up the game and attempting to log in at once that servers couldn't keep up with the demand. It was so much more than they anticipated. People loved that now the flow of battle didn't move at a glacial pace, and the swathe of instance group content which has been implemented throughout the leveling process broke up the cycle of questing and added a 3rd core pillar to stand alongside that and the new Fate system. Alongside the launch also came the game's first instanced endgame raid series, intended to act as a pinnacle challenge for the best of the best, something that hadn't really been present in the original failed release. The first 5 turns of the Binding Coil of Bahamut. This raid was special, not just because it was the inaugural one, but because of how integral it was to the overall game and the discussion surrounding it at that time. The apocalyptic event that literally took down the 1.0 servers was centralized around the fall of Dalamud and the coming of Bahamut. The Elder Primal was established to be this threat that, if not adequately dealt with, could spell the end of the world. The stakes were high, and it was a cliffhanger that players had been left to stew with for over a year, and they were itching to see how it would all play out. Despite that, A Realm Reborn's main story quests scarcely even referenced it, leaving this key piece of backstory unresolved. Like, as an example, Louis Soir, this character that was absolutely central as one of your allies and quest givers in 1.x, was last seen attempting to stave off Bahamut's fierce attacks. He was then mysteriously absent from pre-release materials for A Realm Reborn, as well as the main story quests. There was no confirmed nor proven death, leading many to hypothesize that he may show up in some way. Nowadays in FF14, difficulties for raids are split down the middle, with a normal and a savage tier. The former for players that want to enjoy and experience the story, with the latter targeting those that want a real challenge. The Binding Coil of Bahamut didn't have this. Instead, it just had one difficulty, and if you wanted to see the continuation of this tantalizing plot thread without it being in the form of a YouTube video, you had to engage with the raid and clear it to divest it of its mysteries. Of course, this comes with myriad positives and negatives both, but what it served to do more than anything else was ensure that all eyes from all spectrums of the player base would be locked firmly on the raid as progression began. Being the first raid ever released, the rules of engagement that we take for granted today were an utterly unknown quantity. It was a whole new game, and the race would factor in the knowledge that early challengers were able to garner as they leveled and played through the story. It was a time before the gearing curve had been normalized, and delayed release dates for raids were yet to be established. The duty roulette didn't even exist until 2.1, an entire patch later. Until then, players would need to attain their weekly tombstone cap of 300 by grinding what was often the most efficient endgame option. And this often ended up being speedruns of Wanderer's Palace. In fact, Naoki Yoshida is on the record stating that he anticipated forerunning players to take roughly 6 weeks to finish the story and reach a sufficient gear level to challenge the Binding Coil, with average players expected to join them 2 weeks later. Oh, how wrong he was. Before I tell you how long it actually took though, there was one more quirk to this first raid race that put those booting up the game on launch day at a severe disadvantage. That's because this race didn't actually begin when A Realm Reborn released. It started before. On August 17th, Beta Phase 4 began. As the name would suggest, 3 of these had happened in the past. An opportunity to test server infrastructure, give players a taste of the reworked version of the game, and generate interest. At the end of the weekend, all progress would be wiped, committed to the realm of memory alone. But Beta Phase 4 was unique among them, in that your progress would not be wiped. Instead, it would carry over to the official release of A Realm Reborn, an open beta in which anyone could participate, giving them 2 days to push through the story up till level 20, unlocking and preparing classes as well as acclimating to the new GCD-centric battle system. But 1.0 subscribers were afforded an even more precious boon than this. As thanks for their dedication, these characters from that condemned version could live on, bringing with them their accrued progress in levels, items, and gear. They could log in the moment the Beta Phase 4 went live, import their character and load into Eorzea for the first time with their jobs at level 50, barring Arcanist of course, and get their bearings in preparation for launch. And of course, that is exactly what they did. On August 24th, early access begun for 1.0 subscribers and those that had pre-ordered 2.0. At long last, they had full access without limits to the remade Final Fantasy XIV. From the moment these servers went live, the clock was ticking. One guild that hit the ground running was Blue Garter, a storied community within Final Fantasy MMO circles. Originally formed in the mid-2000s through Final Fantasy XI, they eventually fractured, splitting into 2 distinct factions that shared a name, yet had little to no interaction or common ground. One stayed in Final Fantasy XI, and the other, the one we're talking about in this case, went to World of Warcraft, before eventually shifting to Final Fantasy XIV during 1.0, renaming themselves to Order of the Blue Garter in an attempt to further differentiate themselves from their ex-peers. This group of veterans had a plan: to rush the story, obtain their endgame gear, and immediately tackle the Binding Coil. They didn't have any real aspiration of claiming the title of World First, but they wanted to get stuck in regardless. This wasn't their first rodeo. In the 1.x series, they had collected a slew of accolades that acted to establish them as a real competitor. The first North American group to defeat Ifrit Hard, the second to defeat Good King Mogulmog on release, and the feather in their cap, a world first on Garuda hard mode. The relaunch of FF14 was a new battleground, with ample opportunity for gold and glory both. They wanted to be the best. For Blue Garter and other legacy teams that shared this aspiration, the steps towards the raid were clear, mapped out ahead of them in linearity as early access begun. They would finish the main scenario quests as quickly as possible, using their level 50 pre-level jobs to expedite the process massively, blitzing through the dungeons in pre-made parties, to quickly make it to the end. Then they would follow the side quest chain that would eventually lead them to Wineport, where the Binding Coil of Bahamut would be entered, and challenge it once all 8 of them were ready. The race before the race was one that all had to deal with, but navigating it as smartly as possible would give them every advantage.
Our group was kind of a mismatch of just people that had leveled fast. Our group never really intended to do well Prog.
There were two main considerations that would potentially have them deviate from that path. Firstly, Arcanist, and the powerful shield healer Scholar that came from leveling it. This would slow a group early on, but drastically increase their survivability as the turns got more difficult. It would almost certainly be a necessity at some point, but there was the chance that they could breeze through the early turns with just 2 white mages and a dream to keep them alive. Secondly was when to invest time into getting stronger gear. Farming endgame dungeons like Wanderer's Palace, rearing its head once more, was by far the quickest path to obtain item level 70 Darklight gear, but doing enough to complete a full set would take hours and hours on end, requiring time to be taken away from the main goal. Tomestones of Mythology, the pinnacle capped drop at the time, could be traded for eye level 90 gear, making it essential to stay on top of that too, should Binding Coil prove to be a marathon rather than a sprint. A marathon was expected too, as Yoshida had stated.
多分 2.1 最初の大きなパッチのアップデートまでにクリアできる人の数が100人いかないような気がします。
One thing I have to stress about the launch of 2.0 and Binding Coil's competition is that so much is still up in the air. World Race trackers don't even have a listed first place for the early turns, and only limited information when it came to the overall victor. Players were competing for their own personal sense of fulfillment primarily, rather than for stream views or ranking in a leaderboard. 2013 is a time where streaming video games was just starting to balloon in popularity, resulting in there being at the time no major personalities that regularly streamed the raid and would be competing. The internet was more private and personal, many smaller circles rather than one loose, confusing conglomeration. It was a time where people were still tentatively dipping their feet into the endless depths of social media oversharing. Thus, progress between frontrunners would be shared mostly through word of mouth, internet forums, and Reddit. A race by them and for them, for fun, pure. By the official launch of A Realm Reborn on the 27th, after a weekend of early access, the front-running groups were finished with the main scenario and were forming their parties to delve into the depths of the caverns beneath Castrum Occidens for the first time. In the case of Blue Garter, it wasn't even a locked and fixed static of 8 players, it was just the 8 people from their FC who had leveled the quickest at the time. The prelude was over, and at last the main event was here. Turn 1 begins deep within those caverns, as the intrepid explorers press onwards through stone arteries carved out beneath the land. Sheer rock surrounds them on all sides. It's surprising how vast and spacious it is, despite their depth, glowing with an unnatural orange hue. Bahamut's corruption has managed to spread this far, permeating the earth itself. Deep in the meteor fissure, they come across their first real challenge. Blocking their path is an Allagan defense system. These automated nodes were left by the Allagan Empire as their decline set in, to protect their knowledge and technology from potential threats. A clear sign that this path will eventually bear fruit. It blasts out repelling cannons and piercing lasers at the party, both of which are avoided without major issue. From deep inside it, a thrumming, clicking sound emanates periodically. They don't know quite what it means yet, but it can't be good. What is more of an immediate threat though are the casts of high voltage that it also utilizes. High voltage deals damage to everybody, but also applies a paralysis that cannot be cleansed, immediately transition what was a fairly standard tank and spank into an almost insurmountable task. This cast can be interrupted though, using silences. The only way Forerunning groups found this out was through trial and error, testing different ideas in an attempt to dismantle the threat that high voltage posed. There was no visual indicator on A Realm Reborn's release like you'd find nowadays, so the ADS would never explicitly tell you that an interrupt is the optimal solution. With players having had so little time to acclimate to their jobs, it was easy to throw some puzzling false positives into the mix as well.
We were so new, people were so inexperienced with raiding and even the classes they were playing. The Bard didn't even know he could silence, and nor did the Paladin. We figured this out later because we were like so confused why the boss would sometimes do the stun and sometimes not. And it was because the Paladin was sometimes pulling and doing the silence in his opener, but he didn't even know he had the silence.
The largest danger from the ADS, though, was that it was more than anything a race against time. Reinforcements would routinely appear from behind, pinning them in and forcing the second tank to peel away from the main foe and hold the adds away. These smaller defense systems are arguably a larger threat than the main body, dealing heavy damage with faster attacks to boot. At this point, the adventurers need to make a choice to divert their attention from the boss and assist the off-tank in defeating the adds as they come, or to focus solely on the ADS and hope that he can hold out long enough to allow the rest to carve a path. Many committed to the latter. Those clicking sounds would continue each minute on the dot, and on the 4th, the automated defense system would explode, causing a full wipe. ADS fell quickly, more of a bump in the road for the top groups rather than a full roadblock. Blue Garter's team spent under 3 hours here, most of which was due to confusion in how to deal with or effectively prevent high voltage's paralysis. In another sweeping departure from current FF14 raid design constructs, Turn 1 is more than just a sequence of boss arenas. Instead, it's modelled more after a dungeon, with connective walkways, trash mobs along the way, and dead ends to reward those with good pathing extra time on the final boss. There's even a random chest in one forgotten corner, which bafflingly doesn't drop any raid-related loot, instead offering only X potions, ethers, or high elixirs. Past the indigenous monsters and slightly more threatening golem blocking the way, groups made it to this mechanized honeycomb of platforms, which was slowly but surely being reclaimed by Crystal. Waiting for them there was a giant serpent, and Turn 1's main boss, Caduceus. Interestingly and intentionally prophetically, this name is rooted in ancient Greek mythology. Caduceus is the staff of Hermes, depicting two intertwined serpents, often beneath a pair of wings. Fitting for a foe that fights underneath Bahamut's wing, really. Once the battle is engaged, the path behind and ahead glows, its corrupted ether igniting from your conflict, rendering the path unsafe to walk on. You are trapped there until either you and your allies fall, or Caduceus is defeated. The Great Serpent will regularly use untelegraphed tank busters, a challenge rarely present in the modernized version of the MMO. Instead of seeing a cast bar and being given sufficient warning to react accordingly, animations were the name of the game here. Diligent tanks were rewarded for timing their defensive usages wisely. As the battle between the two sides intensifies, Caduceus regularly swipes away at the melee attacking its flank and rear, as if to scare away the annoying flies repeatedly stinging it. As its frustration rises, it begins to spit poison at its foes, and its damage increases, becoming more of a threat as time goes on. The central mechanic in this fight, though, focuses on the honeycomb tiles themselves, which will occasionally begin to strongly glow in numerous patterns. When they glow after a few seconds, any player still within them will find that a slime spawns in beneath them and begins to attack them, following around and incessantly striking at them until one or the other falls. There are two interesting interactions with this slime. If their target strays too far from them, they will immediately explode, causing so much damage to the party that it risks a raid wipe. And if they are brought close to Caduceus, the serpent will hungrily eye it and shortly afterwards eat it whole. When a slime is eaten, it heals the boss for the amount of health it had remaining when it was consumed, but at the same time, it removes one of those damage ups from its buff bar. This became the challenge that would separate the wheat from the chaff. The groups that were able to effectively juggle incoming damage as well as spawning only the right slimes at the right times to prevent their foes' attacks becoming overwhelming, then feeding them at as low health as possible to avoid unraveling their own progress, would find victory the fastest. Rather than being a telegraphed dance, it was a short looping sequence that would become progressively more difficult, a room with an ever-increasing number of spinning plates. Allow just one to fall and you risk a chain reaction, sending you back to the beginning. A third of the way through, the snake splits in two, that Greek mythological reference coming to fruition, and challengers must pull them apart and tackle both at once. Suddenly, the number of plates doubles and spinning them becomes an altogether more demanding task. Bards were exceptionally strong here, with their silences on demand, ease of mobility to kite and control slimes, as well as solid damage output, and many of those at the cutting edge quickly made the decision to field 2 or more. It was simply the choice that gave them the highest level of leniency and easiest route to success. Resources were precious in early FF14. Cooldown timers were still a concern that needed to be carefully managed, but mana too was a much more easily drained commodity, thanks in part to the heavy reliance healers had on their GCD regeneration tools. Tanks too had to deal with an ever-depleting TP bar, and they couldn't easily sprint to reposition because if they did, they were rendered for all intents and purposes useless, unable to hit their buttons until it slowly regenerated over time. Mitigation was nowhere near as abundant as in the present day. The raid wasn't capable of just throwing 30% damage reduction between them and an incoming hit on a win, meaning that a careful and deliberate approach was a necessity. If the ever-stacking damage buffs weren't carefully kept in control, it was all too easy to make it impossible to keep up with the attacks. To make matters worse, cooldowns did not reset upon wipe, so planning around the use of essential invulnerabilities such as Hallowed Ground wasn't as simple as pressing the button at a pre-planned timing on every pull. Instead, groups either needed to wait in between tries or plan out multiple sequences of defensives to use on alternating attempts.
The first static we ran with in First Coil was just the first 8 people that wanted to raid that got to max level and got gear. Like, for example, some of the people that were in the group I had never even played with. We're going in there as like a completely fresh group of people that most people hadn't even raided before, right?
Despite this being their advent into raiding on the new battle system, the Forerunners stormed through without any real long-term problems. Blue Garter felled Caduceus before the end of their first raid day, claiming world first after just 7 hours within Bahamut's lair. Just a few days later, Yoshida and some of the FF14 team were at PAX holding a presentation and Q&A surrounding the release of 2.0, and he personally congratulated them on their first 4 completion.
Order of Blue Garter 大迷宮バハムートに突入したというニュースが出ているので
Yeah, we just received word that Blue Garter guys have already made it into the binding coil of Bahamut.
世界で最速ですね彼らが
Fastest in the world. USA.
ただ
But
今第2階層いる
on the second turn. Yeah.
何階層まで行った
What turn are you guys on? Second turn?
Second turn?
All across the Myriad Legacy servers, other groups at the cutting edge were also claiming their first raid clears and moving swiftly onwards to the second turn. Despite Blue Garter's lead, this was still very much a close competition. Continuing onwards deeper into the fissure, passing through the labyrinth of crystals that surround them at every turn, the expedition finds their path blocked once again. They're over 900 yalms deep now, and there's no way round. Blocking their way are some of Dalamud's internal defenses, more ADS, but this time they're different than the ones that were encountered in the previous turn. The only way is through. Turn 2 is an interesting type of encounter with a couple of quirks which we've never really seen brought back ever since in the game's raid design. Instead of being comprised of a singular boss, or even a door boss followed by a more threatening main boss later on like in Turn 1, this is instead a gauntlet fight, an interlinked maze-like web of abandoned Allagan hallways and rooms, and occupying each a unique automated defense system with their own mechanics and challenges. There are 6 in total, and behind all of them, in the deepest, most protected chamber, waits the main node, a far more powerful foe than any of the enemies groups have faced thus far. Interestingly, it isn't necessary to defeat all 6 of the smaller nodes. Instead, players are given the choice to carve a path to the final boss in any way they please, and can leave half of the potential targets alive should they wish. But there is an incentive to clear the board. For every node that is defeated, it will disable the final ADS from utilizing their signature abilities in that final battle, reducing their arsenal drastically and making it an easier win. Conversely, each defeated node will provide a passive defensive buff to the others, making subsequent battles tougher. There is an overall enrage timer though, so groups need to carefully decide which nodes to defeat to give them both the best chance of success and enough time to ensure that they can reach the end. The first opponent, one that needs to be felled regardless of which path raiders took, was the monitoring node. It uses the same repelling cannons and interruptible periodic high voltages as Turn 1's version, but will also put up a stacking vol on the tank that forces regular swaps to make attacks survivable. Its signature ability is Vacuum Wave, in which it regularly pulses out damage onto the party in amongst its regular attacks. Alone, it isn't too threatening. Upon death, all living nodes gain a damage up. When the monitoring node is engaged, those same rhythmic clicking sounds from before begin to emanate from it, and when it is defeated, they don't stop. Instead, the clicking can be heard echoing through the corridors from paths yet to be trodden, a reminder of the dangers ahead and the seconds ticking away on their enrage timer, one by one. Following the western path, the sanitary node, attack node, and quarantine node can be found. They introduce Ballast, a growing ring AoE, Gravity Field, which drops puddles on the ground that slow and damage anyone foolish enough to remain or step inside, and Allagan Rot, the main test of the 3, giving a debuff that must be traded to another player via physical contact before it hits 0, and constantly juggled for the rest of the fight. On the east, the defense node will bounce chain lightning between targets, and the disposal node will blast out multiple lines of scorching fire that needs to be avoided. Each of the nodes on the west and east paths, bar the quarantine node, will give the rest a 25% resistance to a particular type of damage when felled. Blunt and piercing on the west, and on the east, magic and slashing. The quarantine node is unique though, in that it passes on a haste buff to future foes. Defeating it eliminates the toughest mechanic of the entire set, but it also affords the boss the strongest buff of all. All that remained afterwards was the main automated defense system. Progression of Turn 2 was much slower than Turn 1, in part because it was more tightly tuned and wasn't as simple as point A to point B. Groups had to consider which route would give them the highest chance of success, after putting in that initial time to figure out how each individual node worked, and how they interacted with the final boss. Planning was key. The other part though, was because of a game-breaking bug, first reported by Blue Garter but also later experienced by other groups, that put their hopes of a fast progression in the dirt. Late in the evening on August 28th, they were practicing against the quarantine node, and when they wiped, instead of the black screen that follows, placing them at the beginning of the turn, alive and intact to try again, it did something else. It just stayed black. When they logged out and back in, they found themselves staring at the corpses of their own characters, just left there. No option to return to the start nor to leave the instance. nor even a timer before they were kicked. In-game support was unable to help, so that was that. There they'd lie in purgatory until the bug was recognized by Square Enix and manually fixed. It ended up taking around 8 hours to manually release them before they could continue progression. Funnily enough, whilst they were released from their virtual jails, this did not permanently fix the issue. Just a week later, Blue Garter's second group were trapped by the exact same black screen for almost 30 hours before they were freed from their jail. It took a while for the root cause to be pinned down and resolved. Bugs aside, Turn 2 was an altogether more daunting challenge than the previous had been. As hours soon turned into days, there still wasn't a single report of a clear. A member of Blue Garter's team posted on the FF14 official forums on the 31st, 3 days after they had downed Turn 1, and told those watching on, eager for information, that this is really intense. Although everyone in the party had to perform well previously, this fight pushes every role in the Trinity to the limit with our level of gear. In another post earlier in the Turn 2 progression journey, he noted that the tuning is spot on thus far. Thank you, Yoshida and the battle team. As August ticked over into September, the attempts kept flying.
I think we went pretty hard at the start. We went like at least 8 hours, I think. Hardcore hours back then were like 8 hours. We didn't really like push the same kind of intensity like groups did now.
Despite each mechanic being simple enough to complete individually, when so many different casts and AoEs and interrupts and rot passes began to intersect with one another over time, it was all too easy to get confused or lose focus, and send the arsenal of spinning plates crashing to the ground. It took time, but after much trial and error, a route was determined. The decision was made by most groups to leave 3 of the nodes alive on the west side, and to concentrate their efforts on removing the threats to the east, and then getting as much time as possible to slowly and painstakingly tackle the main ADS. The central node controlling the others shares mechanics with the rest, and at each 25% increment of its health being reduced, it will draw in one of the surviving nodes from the other rooms and incorporate their attacks into its patterns. With their low week 1 item levels, it could become tight to say the least. This is where scholars would come into their own, offering sucker shields alongside stone skins from the white mages to give that all-important level of leniency. Despite their strength, Forerunner's Blue Garter was still fielding 2 white mages, and more interestingly, a heavily melee-focused comp.
Because we just picked up basically the first 8 people we could, our comp was me on Monk, 2 Dragoons, and a Bard. That fight is very bad for melee. We couldn't kill the last boss because of the comp we had with going to the left. We had to like go to the right and then cross through the middle.
The cost for their choice was that instead of following the route that many others were in regards to room decision, they instead needed to clear out 4 of the nodes before attempting ADS, enabling the melee uptime they desperately needed, but losing valuable time in the final boss with each attempt. Late in the evening of September 1st, Blue Garter were able to push through and claim the clear over 24 hours after they had seen ADS reduced to as low as 15%. Eventually, they built a consistent strategy that had got them through the chaos of the final push. The amount of time it took didn't matter though, not really. They had still been first, and were at last able to enter into the next turn, the midpoint of the Binding Coil. They were pulling away. Binding Coil is unique in FF14 history in that it is the only raid tier ever to have 5 individual floors instead of the standard 4. That is because of Turn 3, an entry that doesn't even drop loot upon completion and was seemingly intended to add more in terms of immersion than challenge. 400 yards deeper than Turn 2 took place, the party comes across what they believe is a shard of Dalamud, though in reality it is the Ragnarok, a colossal starship which fell away from the aforementioned Lesser Moon just before Bahamut burst free of his prison, marking the end of the 1.0 saga. There's no boss here. Instead, it is a fairly simple jumping puzzle broken up by a series of trash mobs no more threatening than those found in between the first and second bosses in Turn 1, or in max level endgame dungeons. The jumping puzzle is clearly signposted with huge blue rings indicating the path downward. Traversing the ruins of the Ragnarok poses no threat at all, in comparison to those that came before. Blue Garter had little trouble securing first for this turn too, downing it shortly after they claimed the win on number 2. Though whether you'd consider this another hotly contested world first, or just an enforced scenic route on the way to turn 4, is totally up to your interpretation. From the 2.0 patch release through to its shift alongside 2.2, Weekly Reset was on a Monday, rather than the Tuesday you may be familiar with today. This left the forerunning group just the rest of their current day, Sunday, to make a dent in whatever Turn 4 had to offer before they were required to re-clear the previous turns for their weeklies. On the downside, it was time taken away from directly making progress, but on the plus side, they had felt the strain of their lack of gear at the end of the ADS encounter, and additional health would provide a boon for what was yet to come. Whilst Blue Garter seemed until this point to have solidified themselves as the front runners of the legacy guilds, they did have something else to worry about. Given the extra week, non-legacy servers had been very busy. They had rushed through the MSQ, leveled their essential jobs, geared up, and obtained their relic weapons. Over on Gilgamesh, a team named Modified defeated Turn 1, and over the next 48 hours, the floodgates opened, with a number more reported from all across the world, claiming server firsts everywhere. The extra gear wouldn't just help Blue Garter, it also allowed non-legacy teams a much easier time closing the gap. New competition was about to enter the race and be well within contention to take first on the only podium that really mattered, Turn 5. Venturing ever deeper, the adventurers press through the ruins of the Ragnarok. Over 1,500 yards deep below the surface at this point, employing the Ragnarok's drive cylinder as a makeshift lift, they proceed towards the main bridge. Yet the way down is not easily yielded, as Dalamud's internal defences will not allow them to pass without a fight. Turn 4 takes place on that elevator, as waves of enemies attack each floor the party descends. This is the second battle of the raid tier so far that rewards smart target prioritization, crowd control, and management of numerous targets in quick succession. Recently, the release of M6S caused a huge stir within the Savage raiding community for being an encounter primarily testing these exact skills. It threw a number of different simple foes at you in various configurations and let you figure out how best to deal with them. But all the way back in 2013, Turn 4 of Binding Coil pioneered these battles seen as non-standard today. 6 waves will hurl themselves at the intrepid explorers, each 1 minute apart, and if they fall behind they may find themselves quickly overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. The waves are comprised of mechanized clockwork soldiers, left on guard duty in perpetuity, bugs that can leech health from their target of choice, soldiers and knights with the capability to drag in foes as well as mitigate or even reflect certain types of damage, spinner rooks that can reduce the max HP pool of a tank if not handled with care, which deal by far the most damage to any foolish enough to stray in front, and will consume any nearby bugs, healing and supplementing their offense with each they claim as prey. This was the point in progression where the lack of gear really started to be felt. Despite Blue Garter having picked up an additional 300 tomestones on Weekly Reset and extra chances at loot from their second Turn 1 and 2 clears, they were struggling. They would either fall behind in terms of damage and then have to deal with an ever increasing number of attackers at once, or the tanks would be overwhelmed, resulting in a chain of deaths. The mechanics were relatively simple, and with careful positioning and target prioritization, they had a plan of action that should theoretically yield fruit. but they just kept hitting a wall. One player said that it's a pure numbers game when it comes down to it. Different groups will need to adapt in different ways, and it really depends on your available job selection. Days passed, and with week 2 of the race in full swing, other groups were catching up. On legacy servers across the world, numerous teams were bashing their heads against the mob onslaught of Turn 4, and in the early hours of the morning of September 5th, a breakthrough happened that worried the frontrunners. Modified, the group that had first claimed Turn 1 from those non-legacy servers, had defeated both Turn 2 and 3, and taken their place with the head of the pack. They had closed the gap and were now fighting on equal footing after a week and a half of playing catch-up. The damage and mitigation check felt overwhelming, even given various job compositions and practice, and a decision had to be made. Wait for more gear, or try something drastic? Eventually, the breakthrough came. They didn't need to fight a war on all fronts. Instead of painstakingly splitting the bugs from their predators, why not allow the mechanic to fail? Let the dreadnoughts eat the bugs. This will drastically increase the damage output that the tanks need to soak for a short period, but came with the benefit of enabling the DPS to focus fire on that singular main threat instead of 2 different split packs, and reducing the overall damage the party needed to output to keep up with the spawning waves. This ended up being the key, and with Turn 4 finally unlocked, progress was slow but consistent. Blue Garter were gaining ground. There was one more daunting challenge waiting for them at the end though. After the 6th and final wave, which featured a whole menagerie of foes including every single variation they had tackled thus far, a soft enrage would begin. Pulsing raid-wide damages never ending until the party is defeated or the floor is cleared. There just wasn't enough damage coming out of the players at this point, so it was inevitable that they'd have to deal with it. With dreadnoughts chunking the tanks and limiting free space, raid-wides blasting out regularly on the full party, and often still a soldier or knight left alive to contend with, it got hectic fast. This was the moment where BG's party composition failed them.
We finally realised, yeah, we need to change comp because this isn't actually possible with the comp we're using. It took us a while to kill it because we got to Turn 4, and then because of the comp we had, we couldn't actually kill it with a comp. It might have been possible, it probably was possible, but essentially what we did is we took a couple of days off, and one of the DPS players leveled Black Mage. We essentially just didn't raid for 3 or 4 days while he leveled it up to max.
One of the white mages was out in favour of a scholar. Their damage needed to be more equally split between physical and magical, so some of the melee had to go. On the 8th of September, practically a full week after Turn 2 and 3 had first fallen, Blue Garter managed to string together the perfect pull. Turn 4 was defeated at long last. Despite the amount of time to clear dwarfing that which Turn 2 took, it actually equaled fewer hours in instance and a lower pull count. So much time was taken enabling this newer, more balanced team comp that it slowed down progression a lot. Regardless, they were finally able to move on to their final test. The end, at long last, was in sight. They took to the forums to celebrate their victory, stating that all we can say is, that fight is tuned to absolute perfection with item level 80 weapons and item level 70 gear. With this race taking place behind the scenes and progress primarily shared on message boards, there was somewhat of a gentleman's agreement in place. Videos of clears would not be shared until at least 3 clears had taken place, or a sufficient time window had passed. They didn't want to spoil the blind experience for other competitors, and they also didn't want to feed information to their opposition. Before top groups began to stream their race to completion, this was usually the done thing. There was a live letter at TGS just a little while later, in which Yoshida mentioned Blue Garter's clear again, solidifying them as the first place finish on Turn 4. He also added that they exceeded his expectations. He had anticipated a Turn 4 clear to happen sometime in the 3rd week, whilst instead the Western team had managed it in 2. Despite the inability to glean any information or advantage from Blue Garter's clear on the 8th, just a day later Modified took down turn 4 as well. The best of the non-legacy servers had now hurtled past most legacy competitors and taken to the podium. They were now neck and neck with Blue Garter as the push to defeat the final boss, Twintania, began. When the elevator hits rock bottom, the adventurers push forward until they come to a realization. They are no longer standing on corrupted crystals nor ancient Allagan paving. Over 1900 yards deep, they have found the remains of the primal Bahamut. There, on his claw, they are assailed by the ancient dragon Twintania, and the final battle begins. A 13-minute multi-phase war of attrition, and for the eventual victors, the single longest fight to beat in Final Fantasy XIV history. The opening forays are simple enough. Twintania is flanked by her dragons, the Scourges of Mericidia, which must be felled whilst one tank holds the boss at bay, before the raid turns their attention fully to the main threat. The threat this dragon poses is dripping from every attack. Her tank buster named Death Sentence, the puddles of fire titled Liquid Hell that she shoots towards stragglers. She is not messing around. The first half of this battle alternates fireballs which must be shared with allies to lessen their pain, and conflagration, trapping its victim in a fiery prison which must be destroyed before they overwhelm their prey. These aren't inherently difficult, but they ping-pong between requiring precise mitigation, then DPS players blasting their offensive cooldowns before the conflags fail in quick succession. These timings are not consistent either, with mechanics drifting and overlapping and interlocking, needing to be handled with the utmost care. Throughout this section, Twintania will periodically drop neurolinks on the ground beneath her. These are seemingly useless for now, but will no doubt come into play later on. After this comes the intermission of the battle, the ads phase. Here is where the frontrunners got to experience for the very first time what was to become a staple in raid mechanics: dive bombs. Twintania leaves the battlefield looping around before hurtling through the center of the arena, directly towards her chosen target. Many groups quickly learnt that the best way to handle this was to use the arena's own verticality to their advantage. This isn't a flat surface after all. There are nooks and crannies, especially in this little corner in particular, that are actually a little lower than the rest of the room. Dive bomb actually only registers a hit at the height its target is when it locks in. So if you're standing at the bottom of the slope when the dive bomb targets, and then you take just a few steps forward up the hill and wait there until the dive actually executes, Twintania will dive below you off the edge of the map, and you'll be completely safe. Using this strategy eliminated the need to check the direction of the dives and most of the chance for failure, replacing it all with a single moment of precise timing to correctly resolve. In the wake of the dive bombs came the serpent Asclepius and its smaller kin, the Hygeia. Another reference to ancient Greek mythology, it refers to the god of medicine and one of Apollo's sons. Hygeia is one of Asclepius's daughters and represents one of the healing aspects of medicine. Both are traditionally linked with serpents and snake-entwined staves similar to Caduceus. This is a symbol that we see a lot nowadays in the medical field, like the Star of Life here and the American Medical Association both don the serpentine staff in their logo. In turn 5, the party will be dealing with Asclepius whilst dive bombs occur, but it's an overwhelming task. It just has so much health. But when a Hygeia is killed, in their death throes they let out a screech that gives vulnerability to all those nearby. This is the key. Killing these smaller enemies allows the larger one to be felled quickly in tandem, and making use of their caster limit break would enable this to go cleanly and without a hitch. With that, and using the Neurolinks to survive the destruction of the return of Twintania to the battlefield, we'll draw the first 9 minutes of the encounter to a conclusion. The real battle can begin now. But getting to this point was far from smooth sailing. Sometimes the Hygeia ads would just not die under certain circumstances, even when brought to 0 health, adding mounting frustration to an already drawn out progression. For the next quarter of Twintania's health pool came the Twisters and the Dreadknights. These chimerical beasts would appear seemingly from nowhere, choose a victim, and root them to the ground. Then the slow march of death would begin. If they reach their prey, they will toss them like a ragdoll, immediately killing them before selecting a new target. This became a test of effective crowd control and DPS bursting for those tackling them early, because if the Dreadknight wasn't immediately dispatched before it could find its mark, things could snowball out of control all too easily. For the final push, these threats were replaced by more liquid hells and hatches. These hatch orbs emanate from the boss and chase down their target fast, exploding upon contact. The only real way to surpass them is to plant within one of the neurolinks that have been dropped periodically. A rapidly devised solution to the logistical nightmare that hatched through in most parties' plans was to fill a neurolink beneath Twintania with the off-tank, and use them as a human sponge to soak up even the hatches designated for other targets. If all of that goes smoothly, the boss should, in theory, fall. But it wasn't happening. Days turned into an entire week, and the only real updates being delivered to the eagerly waiting public were in the form of a mounting number of bug reports. Groups seemingly were not even close to chaining together a clean attempt.
People will look back at Twintania and be like, oh, it took so long. But what people don't really think about is when we got to Twintania, it was already so far into like the prog cycle. We were raiding probably 3 or 4 hours a day, max. I don't even think we were doing 7 days a week at the time. I think we were doing like 4 or 5 days a week. Every day you would have to relearn, so you spend like the first hour of every raid relearning the fight because people would forget stuff. We could have killed that fight about a month earlier. What we did essentially when we were learning the fight is we kept dying to certain things. Like a tank kept getting one shot by stuff. So we did this really dumb thing of like, okay, we want to line up the fight differently. So we want her to do certain things at certain times to make it easier to push the fight. We held DPS for like 2 minutes. We did not know at the time that the fight had an enrage timer that started at the start of the fight. I assumed that there was an enrage in the last phase. Just because of the way we were doing the fight, we were hitting the last phase at the same time every single time. And essentially what ended up happening is we wiped, I think 3 times in the last phase to the enrage, the 13-minute rage. And that's a 13-minute rage with us not DPSing for 2 minutes.
But this conversation would take on a whole new tone after the next revelation. On September 19th, 2013, a post surfaced on Reddit. It was the kill screen, and even an additional screenshot of the character next to the chests. Twintania had been defeated, but the title wasn't celebratory, nor were the comments congratulatory. The world-first victory over the Binding Coil had been claimed due to a game-breaking bug. The Moogle-based team that first reported this clear on a burner account to avoid harassment stated that we have already submitted a GM ticket reporting this, explaining to Square Enix how this bug happened. I will not explain how to replicate it here, but it basically results in the boss just standing there from 80% HP doing nothing until you kill it. As I said, we've already submitted a GM ticket reporting this. We are not claiming world first. It was a strange situation. No other group had reported even coming close yet, and the race was 3 weeks deep at this point, and then out of nowhere, after nigh on 10 days of silence, the world first clear happens due to a bug. Other front-running groups as well as those on the sidelines had vastly differing opinions on the matter. Some showed respect to the Moogle-based group, thankful that they had kept the specifics of the bug private and that they were sharing the information with Square Enix in hopes of a fix. Others believed that they deserved to be banned for violating terms of service, and that the only respectable approach to experiencing a bug that would deliver a free clear would be to wipe and then report it, rather than accept ill-begotten gains. They cited a post on the Lodestone as their primary reasoning, which mentioned that if a player willfully continues to battle an immobilized monster, the player will be in violation of the user agreement. The game logs of violators will be investigated, and those who are found to be in violation may be subject to punishment. This was in context to a bug with the Relic quest, but seemed fairly easy to apply to this situation too. A few days later, whilst at the Tokyo Game Show, Square Enix put out a blog post that confirmed that no recognized world first had yet occurred, but made no mention of the bugged clear. It took almost 2 weeks for an official response, but finally on October 8th, the community had one. The development team confirmed the existence of the bug and that they had been able to replicate it, and thanked the raid group for bringing it to their attention. They would not be punished for their clear. In an interesting development, Turn 5 would be unavailable for the foreseeable future whilst the team worked diligently to put together a fix. It took a full week until October 15th to become available again. Just a day later, Twintania's floor was made unavailable. The bug had been replicated and confirmed to not have been fixed after all. On the 24th of October, after another week and a half of hiatus from progression, the turn at last opened once again, with the immobilization bug fixed. Well over 2 weeks of potential progression time had been lost, with raiders twiddling their thumbs waiting for a resolution. And now, with an extra few weeks of gear behind them, the race for World First was on once more. But there was one point of contention that rivaled even the bugged clear, and in the hotfixes had been noticeably absent: the twister mechanic. As frustration mounted in the community and a clear was nowhere in sight, discussion sparked up as to whether this mechanic was bugged. There was no clear indication for how it recognized a success or failure state with any real level of consistency, and players were struggling. Clips like this began to surface, showcasing that if it was a simple case of needing to move during the cast, then the snapshotting or latency had some deeply serious issues. This was the main reason a legitimate clear had not happened. Either groups were wiping to Twister, or they would lose enough players throughout the phase that it made the enrage timer all but impossible to overcome. Further fuel was added to the fire when a thread complaining about twisters was added to the accepted bug section on the forums. Despite that, when the immobilization bug was resolved during those 2 extended periods of maintenance, any patch notes or updates regarding twisters were mysteriously absent. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. The wall holding back the competitors would continue to hold steady. During the second maintenance, a Square Enix community rep issued a statement in the Binding Coil discussion thread, mentioning that bugs that have been moved to the accepted bugs forum are those that have sufficient information to be investigated. Although a reported bug was moved to the accepted bug forum, that does not mean that what is reported is an actual confirmed bug, scuppering those that still hoped for a fix soon. They followed up by stating that there have been a lot of comments about how surviving Twintania's twister ability is seemingly random. Please know that it is not random, and that the development team has adjusted the difficulty of this battle to be of the highest level that is in the game currently. With that said though, it was still designed to be beaten. While we definitely cannot comment on strategy, we believe that a valiant group will be able to defeat Twintania. It felt like a direct challenge to those who had succumbed, those who had given up progression in their frustration. Play better. Find the key. This is beatable.
Twisters was not bugged. It was a poorly designed mechanic. It didn't have floor markers, it didn't have any of that stuff. Essentially, you just died if you did it wrong. So a lot of people back then when they were trying it were like, okay, so let's try standing still. You die. Okay, let's just try running. You die. And then they're like, okay, it must be bugged and it doesn't work correctly. Okay, there must be a way to do this mechanic. There must be a safe spot.
Just a few days after maintenance ended on October 26th, 65 days after Binding Coil's world race had begun, another post went live on discussion forums.
Get it! Killer, fucking killer, holy shit! Oh my fucking god! Fucking shit! Holy fucking shit! You fucking badasses!
You guys fucking did it?
Yes!
Wow.
Oh, I'm fucking shaking.
Blue Garter had cleared the raid. A video would be coming shortly, and that video would confirm beyond doubt that yes, in the final moments before Enrage had claimed their lives, the group had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. They were the first ever FF14 world first. Blue Garter had cemented their names in the game's history forever. A clean sweep, and as Yoshida had said all those weeks ago, they had confirmed themselves as the pride of the West. Fittingly, it was a truly international team, comprised of 3 Americans, 3 Europeans, a Canadian and an Australian. This moment belonged to them. Just like the bugged kill a month earlier, responses on the forums were mixed. Many offered their congratulations and celebrated the win, whilst others were incredulous. How had they managed to overcome Twisters, whilst other groups were unable to formulate any consistent strategy? It was hard to believe. Throughout the second half of the race, many groups had taken to the forums to provide feedback and complaints about the mechanic, discussing with one another, whilst Blue Garter, almost alone, had remained quiet, sticking to themselves aside from a scant comment that they believed Twisters were working as intended. They had put their heads down and grinded out the win. But really, only the opinion of one mattered, Naoki Yoshida. And a few days later, on October 30th, he gave it. He mentioned Blue Garter, referring to them as the Excalibur team, and congratulated them on their world first clear. He mentioned that he was excited for them and, at the end, as a small personal note, once more called them the pride of the West. There was to be no more doubt, discussion, nor deliberation. They were the victors. That wasn't all, though. He also announced a slew of bug fixes to the fight and, interestingly, a rework to Twisters. He stated that a number of players have asked if the mechanic of Twister are random, but as we have answered previously, this is not a random attack. That said, we believe the timing of this attack to be too unforgiving. Adjustments will be made to Twister so that the timing required to survive this attack is not quite so severe. This is how the current iteration of Twister, the one that Final Fantasy XIV players may recognize today, both in Turn 5 and in future iterations, like the Ultimate based on Coil's Raid series, came into being. But the million-dollar question, really, is how did Twisters work beforehand? What was the secret to Blue Garter's success? The piece of information others had been unable to garner.
We believed it was a donut. So if you were in the middle of the donut, you died. If you got too far away from the donut, you died. The problem with that as well, though, is you have a game that has horrible netcode, and you have a game that's running at 200 ping for most people. Every pull, the actual mechanic itself is going off at different times in the cast bar. The way that we ended up doing it, we had this stupid little movement. Basically, we did like a little square. You basically would go like left, down, right, up. But you like try to never go back to the same spot. Basically just make a little square shape and you would kind of just stay in a certain distance from the starting point. And it worked. For me personally, like I did it almost every time perfectly. In our kill video, the scholar died to it. So everyone's like, see, you still were dying to it. It must be bugged. No, he just messed up. A lot of people just weren't trying, I don't think, because they thought it was bugged. Yes, it's cool that we were the only group that ever killed unnerfed Twisters, but it's like, I really wish more people actually got to experience Twisters. And I think that us killing it would have pushed groups to try to kill it with the unnerfed version of it. But like, because Square Enix hotfixed it so fast, it didn't even give people a chance. Square Enix were clearly holding on to that hotfix until we killed it. They saw that we were close, right? Because we were getting close over and over and over again. They probably could have hotfixed it when the fight was down for 2.5 weeks, but they chose not to until after we killed it.
By the end of October, World Second had been taken by a team on Adamantois, a non-legacy server. Though the legacy advantage had long been rendered null with the many weeks of maintenance and progression, as well as item levels which had basically been equalised between the two, it was still fitting that the first and second would be shared by a legacy and a non-legacy guild. Changes to Twister opened the floodgates, and in the coming weeks, more clears would be reported as a strange yet exciting chapter in FF14's history came to a close. From there, players looked forward to future releases. The Crystal Tower 24-man Alliance raid, originally intended for 2.0, but pressed back to the next patch. And further forward, the upcoming second wing of the Binding Coil. The expansion was far from over, and there was still much to play for. But that's a story for another time.
Technically, I think the dip is due to me. When we were progging Twintania, we could not survive the dive bombs at all. Especially with high latency, it's literally impossible to dodge. And I remember taking a bunch of screenshots midway through the prog, and I'm like, guys, can't we just stand here? Not realizing at the time that spot actually made her dive outside the arena. Not really intended, but everyone uses it nowadays. It does make me sad though, because it essentially is the reason why we just have these circle and square arenas that have no height differences or anything anymore. Twintania really, I think, kind of broke them in terms of them really not wanting certain things to be abused anymore.
Looking back to that entire debacle with the bugged kill, this could so easily have gone a different way, but that Moogle team handled their false victory with grace, avoiding losing their own honour and stepping aside to allow the crown to be passed on correctly. They did the right thing, and they can be proud of that. The Binding Coil leaves a deeply impactful legacy in the history of the game that houses it, in the memories of those that tackled it on content, as well as the player-built lore of their community's history. It will forever be the longest raid tier, a competition for in-game and shared via periodic posts on internet forums rather than streams. Personal, moderate, theirs.
I love prog, but I didn't do it because I wanted to win. I wasn't raiding to win, I was raiding because I enjoyed the challenge. I wish they would go back to the creativity they had in Coil and Alexander. Because I definitely think that, yes, there's a lot of jank in those tiers, but they would benefit from thinking outside the box a little bit more again. I think people would actually enjoy those types of fights more than they realize if they existed again. Square Enix have gotten to this point of everyone cares so much about passing that you can't have a mechanic that takes people off the boss. That's so sad. I would rather them actually design fun encounters, man.
Whilst the fight today doesn't hold many of the challenges that acted as linchpins for the intrepid early raiders, through both job buffs and battle nerfs, it is still very much worth your time. It's an insight into that which came before, and more than anything, fun. And for the members of Blue Garter, though they have since gone their separate ways, it is a cherished moment in their collective history that they all share, even apart. The time that they took on the most grueling task that Eorzea could muster, and overcame. Thank you so much for watching this video if you managed to make it all the way to the end. I really appreciate it. I have a Patreon, you don't need to support it, but if you do, it allows me to keep uploading here more regularly. If you want to see the uncut version of my conversation with Tyrith, it's available exclusively there, as well as pre-release excerpts for upcoming videos. The people on screen now are the reason I was able to make this one, and I'm greatly appreciative. No pressure, though. And, of course, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.